And no, that's good. And thanks for the invite to come here today. The story starts today with my family, and my dad was a fourth generation farmer from country Victoria. And interestingly enough, I continue to see people who talk about the word disruption and what goes on in their lifestyles and their businesses, and disruption's constant. But Dad took over the family business and did exactly as he was taught by his father, which unfortunately sent the business into a spiral after him operating it for 10 years. So he eventually had to come home and explain to the family that at the age of 42, the family business was gone. It was a farm and cannery business down there, and it was all over. And I can only imagine at the age of 42 being in a situation where you had to start again with 3 young kids. So he took about 6 months and eventually decided that he was going to go into small business, and he came home and excitedly said to the family, "We're going into small business and we're moving to a town called Beechworth." And we got in the car and we drove to Beechworth, and we're very excited. First and foremost, my brother and I, who were 11, had never been to the beach before. And we got in the car and we drove for 3 hours, and we realised it was 3.5 hours from Melbourne. It was nowhere near the beach. It said population 3,500, and as we drove in, Dad said, "We're going to be the 3rd largest employer in town." And we thought, oh, this is going to be great. And we had 9 employees. We were the 3rd largest employer in town. The 2nd largest employer was the jail, and the largest employer was the mental hospital. And that was Beechworth. And we moved into Beechworth and the business kicked off. And in small business, in particular with farming, you need rain. And when you own a small soft drink factory, you need long, hot summers. And we had 3 years with no summers. They literally lasted about 6 or 8 weeks. And Dad was so desperate that I would get in the car and we would drive down to Bendigo, and he would get a bag of cash from my grandfather and bring it back up so we could put money in the bank and make the payroll. And that went on for about 2 years. And it was desperate times. I didn't understand a lot of what was going on. I was just a kid. But I remember, I think the 2nd or 3rd summer, I was getting in the truck at 4 o'clock in the morning and heading up through the Riverina to deliver soft drinks out to all these little cafes and milk bars and so forth. And Dad walked out and he had this big box of gifts. And all of these gifts had been individually wrapped and signed for all of these customers. And he said, "Now, every time you get to one of these pubs or cafes and so forth, I need you to climb down into the cellar, rotate the stock." He always had business first. Clean out all the dead rats, spiders and cockroaches, stack all the stock, load the truck, then go up and wash your hands, and then go to the customer and thank them for doing business and give them this gift. And every time I gave them out this gift, you'd sort of see them open up and their face would light up. And I remember one particular one was a personally autographed book from a famous footballer in the time, a fellow by the name of 𝗨𝗿𝗯𝗵. And Dad had found out that that particular customer had been a mad AFL fan, and he'd loved this 𝗨𝗏𝗯𝗵, and he got to know these customers well. And I got back that night and he said, "How did it all go?" And I said, "Good." And he said, "How did you go giving out all the gifts? Did they like them?" And I said, "Yeah, they went well." And he said, "Do you know why we do that, why we give out gifts at Christmas time?" And I said, "Oh, because it's Christmas." And he said, "No." He said, "The only way we can differentiate ourselves against the big guys," which was Coca-Cola and Tarax and Schweppes, he said, "is to build relationships with them. And it's our only point of difference." And he said, "So in small business, you eat what you kill and you go and hunt every day." And I'm like sitting there as a 13-year-old kid going, "Yeah, okay, no problem." But strangely enough, that stuck with me for years and years and years. You eat what you kill and you hunt every day. I think by the 3rd year, Dad got into the groove. We started getting some long, hot summers, and we started building a fantastic relationship with that particular business. Does anybody ever been to Beechworth? Hands up. It's famous for its lunatic asylum. No? Has anybody ever been or heard of the Beechworth Bakery? Okay, somebody at the back. So Beechworth as a town was totally reliant on 2 government employers. And in a period of 5 years, the government shut down both of those institutions, and the whole town had to reinvent itself. And it's gone from a town that was the 2nd highest consumption of alcohol and the highest level of domestic violence in Australia, to a town that is now one of the highest tourist meccas in Australia. It took them 25 years to turn around and rebuild that whole town as a place where everybody wants to go and visit and enjoy the bakery and go to Bilson's. Now, has anybody heard of Bilson's soft drinks, Bilson's lemonade, Bilson's? Okay, so that was my dad's business. So that was also reinvented. And I just love talking about the fact that as soon as somebody else sees something stale, dead, and absolute shit, it can be recreated, rebuilt, and done so much better by the next person if they think about it a little bit differently. So at the grand old age of 15, I decided I wanted to go and become a baker. And I challenged my father, and he said, look, if you think you can get yourself a job, I will let you go and take on an apprenticeship. So I applied for a job, and it was in the neighbouring town. So I had to find a way to leave home at 15 and go and live in an apartment and work in an industrial bakery. So it was, I think, 9 weeks after I turned 15, I left home, I moved to Wodonga and started my apprenticeship in industrial bakery. In fact, it was the largest industrial bakery in the Southern Hemisphere. And my first day on the job, I walked in and there was an oven probably a little bit bigger than this room. And it was right at the back of the factory. And my job was to go down the back and stack bread tins from 10 o'clock at night onto a conveyor. There's 6,000 bread tins. And then I would watch them go around for about 3 or 4 hours, and then I would stack them back up again. And that's all I did every day for the next 2 years, 6 nights a week. Anyway, I look back now and I go, the greatest thing that ever happened to me was the first job was the worst job. Like, everything after that was awesome. I got a job in a bakery 6 months after I finished my apprenticeship when it was air conditioned. I couldn't believe how happy I was, because we just used to sweat and die through summer, and that was the way it was. 6 months before I finished my apprenticeship, I got offered the opportunity to go to Melbourne and play in the AFL. And the scouts came in and said, we want you to come down. I think the culture with young people and the way they look at employment now has changed a little. But back then, if you were 6 months off finishing your apprenticeship, you wouldn't consider leaving. So I said to them, thanks, but no thanks. I've got 6 months to finish my apprenticeship, and I didn't take that opportunity. 6 months later, to the day when I finished my apprenticeship, they walked me in the office and said, congratulations, you're fired. And I lost my job right there. Now, what we had in Australia back then was 17% unemployment. And also, a job was a privilege and not a right. And I also still think it should be a privilege and not a right. So I rang the guys in Melbourne and said, look, I'd like to come down and have a run. And they said, no, you've missed the cut. There's no chance you can come down this season. Maybe next year. Maybe if you've got nothing else to do, go and play football somewhere else. And I said, where would they play football in summer? And he said, the Northern Territory. So I got on a bus and I arrived in Alice Springs a day and a half later, and I started playing football. There was a whole bunch of us up there. We're 19 years of age. And I must have been there maybe 2 months. And a guy said to me at the football club one night, what do you do for a living? And I said, I'm not doing anything at the moment. I drive tourist buses out to Ayers Rock on the weekends, and other than that, I'm just playing football. And he said, yeah, but do you have a trade? And I said, yeah, I'm a baker. And he got excited and he said, you know, there's a bakery here in town that's gone broke. It's got a big for sale, for lease sign on the front of it. Maybe you and I should go into business. And I said, oh really? What do you do? And he said, I'm a motor mechanic. And he was your typical kind of motor mechanic with filthy fingernails and non-matching thongs and his ass crack hanging out of his shorts. And we thought, what a terrific idea. We'll go to business. Why wouldn't you? So we went off to the first bank and the second bank and the third bank, and we finally realised that banks weren't really interested in giving 19-year-old blokes money to start a business. I don't know why. To this day, I still can't understand why. And as we were sitting around working out how we were going to get this money, one of the guys from the footy club pulled up and he had a brand new car. And everybody mulls out and have a look at the car, and someone said, oh, how did you get the car? You know, where'd you get the money? You'd been dealing drugs, stuff like that. And the guy said, no, all I needed to do was prove to the bank that I had a job and I could get a car loan. Now, this was the days before everything was proved on Google, before you had to go through all these security checks and everything. Basically, you could bullshit and lie your way through things, as long as they were good white lies, you know, things that didn't hurt anybody, especially banks. So we actually come up with this plan that all we needed to do was go to the bank and apply for a car loan. And if we got the car loan approved, we'd get the money and we would sell the car and get the cash and open the business. So we went off to the one bank that we hadn't applied for a business loan. We applied for car loans. We put the phone on at home and we waited for the bank manager to ring and check our references. We gave each other outstanding references. We'd been working there for some time. And we got the cars and we sold the cars literally that next day somewhere else in Alice Springs, and we got the cash and we opened the business. And it's funny, you think about today, whether that was immorally incorrect or whatever, and of course, not when it comes to dealing with the tax department or the banks, I don't think it is. But for me, it was about getting the job done. Whatever it took to get the job done. We never at one stage thought, oh, this isn't going to happen because. It was like, no, we need to find a way. And we just kept working and working and working. And I think that culture continued for me. And we opened up the bakery probably $2,000 in our opening week. And within 6 months, we were doing big sales, and it was a great business. And we were paying off the car loans of the business bakery loan. And the bank manager walks in one day. Now, if anybody's ever dealt with a bank manager, you know what they carry on like. Like if you borrow money off them, you should name your first child after them, and there's no bank managers in the room, is there? They do sneak in with the humans. Anyway, the bank manager walks in, he's standing at the front counter where the girls were serving, and I was at the front of the shop pulling pies out of the oven, and I looked up and he gave me a big smile and he said, "Hey Tommy, how's that car of yours going?" And he was leaning on the till, and I said, "It's pretty good, you're leaning on the steering wheel." And he sort of looked at me, and I walked back out to my partner and I said, "We need to pay out those car loans before anything happens and we get caught out." But the business was quite successful, and about a year and a half later, I got the opportunity to go back down to Melbourne and try out in the AFL. I did my 9 weeks pre-season, and I got called in by the assistant coach, and he said, "Let's have a bit of a chat about your future." And I don't think anybody had ever sat me down, including my own parents, and said, "Let's talk about your future." And he said, "I've got good news and bad news." And I said, "Well, what is it?" And he said, "The good news is you're a hell of a clubman. You work harder than anybody else. You've improved dramatically over the pre-season. Everybody likes you. You tell really funny stories. We love having you around the club." And I said, "Terrific." And he goes, "The bad news is you're never going to play AFL football." And I said, "Well, why is that?" And he said, "Just lack of talent." And he totally smashed me right there. And funnily enough, like 25 years later, I ran across that guy because I was appointed onto the AFL Commission. And he said to me, "How the hell did you get on the AFL Commission?" And I said, "Well, it had nothing to do with talent." And it was just a bit of a payback discussion. But I got up and I walked out of that meeting that day, and I thought to myself, this is actually a blessing, because all I ever wanted to do was go into business and be in food. And this was just really a distraction. And I heard the boss talk before about shiny things. And there are so many shiny things that can distract you from what really matters. And for me, I wanted to go back and do what I wanted to do, and that was work in the food game. In that particular period, I got a job working in a supermarket group, and their job was to set up bakeries in supermarkets. This had never been done before. These were what's known as a disruptor. And interestingly enough, and I always like to talk about this, and I was a bit jealous too, you talked about your book being an international bestseller. Is that right? Because
I didn't say that.
well, I think you did. I think it was on tape. This is an Australian bestseller, right? It took me a long time to come up with the name of it. It's called The Eagle Boys Story. And I've got a little trivia question for you today. And the trivia question is, and I'll come to the answer in a minute, but the trivia question is, who was Australia's largest company in the 90s? And I just want to point out as well, in Australia, you have to sell or print 10,000 copies of a book for it to become a bestseller. And I got this book put together and printed and made in 2010. I got 10,000 copies of them delivered to my offices down in West End. And 2.5 months later, the Brisbane floods came through and washed 9,940 copies down the river. So I rang my publisher and I said, I need another 10,000 copies. And she said, holy shit, you got a bestseller. So there it is.